The year was 1945. Europe was nothing but ruins, cities reduced to ash, millions of lives lost, and an empire that once dreamed of ruling the world had collapsed in disgrace. The guns had finally gone silent, but another kind of battle was about to begin. For the first time in human history, the victors of a world war would not simply divide territories and crown themselves with glory. This time, they would put the leaders of a defeated nation on trial. Not just soldiers who pulled the trigger, but the men who signed the orders. The masterminds, ministers, generals, propagandists, the architects of mass destruction. It was a gamble unlike anything seen before. Could justice exist after such chaos? Could laws restrain men who had unleashed the deadliest war the planet had ever known? Or was this nothing more than the theater of the victors, a performance to justify their own power? On November 20th, 1945, inside a courtroom in the bombed-out city of Nuremberg, the world gathered to find out. 24 of the highest-ranking Nazis, once untouchable, now sat in the dock like common criminals. Behind them stood American soldiers with rifles. Above them, the eyes of history. This was not just a trial. This was humanity's first attempt to put war itself on trial. Nuremberg was chosen for a reason. The city once hosted the grand rallies of the Nazi Party, massive spectacles where Hitler's voice echoed through seas of swastikas. Now, those same streets lay in rubble, charred and silent. It was poetic justice. The birthplace of Nazi propaganda would become the stage for its funeral. The Palace of Justice was one of the few buildings still standing. Its walls were cracked, its windows shattered, but inside, carpenters worked day and night to rebuild a courtroom strong enough to hold history. High wooden benches, steel bars, translation booths, rows of press seats. It was designed not only for justice, but for the world to witness it. And the world was watching. Cameras had been installed, something unprecedented for that time. Journalists poured in from every corner of the globe. This trial wasn't just for the victors, it was for future generations. If justice could work here, maybe it could work anywhere. The defendants were brought in, one by one. There was Hermann Goering, Hitler's right-hand man, the flamboyant Reichsmarshal who once commanded the Luftwaffe. Even in defeat, he carried himself with arrogance, as if the trial itself were beneath him. Beside him sat Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer, whose strange flight to Scotland in 1941 still baffled many. Now he stared blankly, sometimes confused, sometimes muttering to himself. Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal who signed countless death orders with a flourish. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the smooth-talking foreign minister who brokered pacts and betrayals. Julius Streicher, the venomous propagandist whose newspaper spewed hatred that paved the road to genocide. Each man represented a different face of the Nazi machine. Together, they were the embodiment of a nightmare the world never wanted to see again. When the judges entered, 4 of them, from the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, the silence in the room was suffocating. Everyone knew this was bigger than just punishment. This was about defining what crimes mankind could never again allow. The charges were read: crimes against peace, waging aggressive war; war crimes, violations of the rules of war; crimes against humanity, murder, enslavement, extermination of civilians. It was the first time in history that crimes against humanity were recognized in law. And it was clear this trial wasn't just about Germany. It was about setting a precedent for the entire world.
Yet beneath the solemnity, tension crackled. Could these men truly be judged fairly by those who had just defeated them? The Soviets, after all, had committed their own atrocities. The British and Americans had firebombed cities like Dresden. But here, at this moment, it was the Nazis in the dock, and history demanded answers. The proceedings began, and with them, the unraveling of the Third Reich's darkest secrets.
From the very beginning, the prosecutors knew that this trial would not be won by rhetoric alone. The Nazi leaders sitting in the dock were masters of words. They had built an empire on propaganda, deception, and manipulation. If the Allies came with speeches, the defendants would twist them into defiance. No, this trial would be built on evidence. Cold, undeniable, horrifying evidence. The films. On the third day of the trial, the lights in the courtroom dimmed. A projector rattled to life. On the screen appeared the images that had been filmed only months earlier when Allied troops liberated the concentration camps. The footage was raw, unfiltered, impossible to watch without nausea. Mountains of skeletal corpses stacked like firewood. Survivors with hollow eyes, their bodies little more than skin stretched over bone. Piles of shoes, glasses, children's toys. The possessions of millions who had entered the camps but never returned. General Dwight Eisenhower himself had ordered the filming. He had walked through the camps personally, and when he saw the horror, he gave an order. Film everything. Record everything. Get the evidence, because some bastard will say this never happened. Now that evidence filled the courtroom. Reporters wrote that hardened soldiers wept openly. Even the defendants shifted uncomfortably. Julius Streicher, the propagandist who had preached hatred against Jews for decades, sat pale, muttering to himself. Goering, usually arrogant, avoided looking at the screen. When the film ended, silence hung in the room. It was not the silence of respect, but the silence of shock, the kind that comes when words are useless. The documents. But the Allies did not stop with films. They came armed with paper, mountains of it. The Nazis, obsessed with bureaucracy, had recorded everything. Orders, memos, signatures, the very machinery of death was catalogued in neat folders. And now those folders sat in the hands of prosecutors. There were memos signed by Keitel authorizing executions of prisoners of war, letters from Ribbentrop arranging the deportation of Jews, minutes from high-level meetings where the final solution was planned, spoken about in cold, technical language, as if the extermination of millions were nothing more than a logistical problem. Each document was a nail in the coffin of denial. Each signature dragged the defendants deeper into the pit of guilt. Then came the survivors. One by one, men and women stepped into the witness box. Some wore the striped uniforms of the camps, refusing to take them off even after liberation. Their voices trembled, but their words were steady. They spoke of cattle cars packed so tightly that people suffocated before arriving, of children torn from their mothers' arms, of guards who laughed while beating prisoners to death, of doctors who performed experiments with no anesthesia just to see how long a human could survive. The judges listened, the press scribbled furiously, and the world, through newspapers and newsreels, began to realize the scale of the nightmare. This was not just war. This was something darker, something humanity had no word for. And so a new word was born during these trials: genocide. The turning point. For the defendants, the evidence was a tidal wave. Some tried to fight it. Goering, ever the showman, argued that he had never directly signed orders for mass killings, that he was a soldier, not a murderer. Others claimed ignorance, insisting they had no idea what was happening in the camps. But the paper trail was merciless. The witnesses were undeniable, and the films. The films spoke louder than any courtroom speech ever could. The Nuremberg Trials were no longer just about punishing men. They were about holding a mirror to humanity, forcing it to stare into its darkest reflection. As prosecutor Robert Jackson, the American chief counsel, thundered in his opening statement, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their repeating." The world had heard the evidence. Now it would wait for justice. If the evidence was overwhelming, the defendants were not about to go quietly. Many of them saw the trial as their last stage, their final chance to twist history in their favor. And leading that defiance was Hermann Goering, the showman of the dock. Even stripped of his uniform and medals, Goering carried himself with a kind of defiant arrogance. He saw the trial not as judgment, but as theater, and he intended to play the leading role. When questioned about the crimes of the Reich, he smirked and claimed ignorance. When asked about Hitler's orders, he described himself as a loyal soldier, a patriot doing his duty. At times, he even mocked the court, scoffing at the idea that victors could sit in judgment over the vanquished. But Goering's true weapon was his oratory. On the witness stand, he turned the tables. He lectured the judges on geopolitics, accused the Allies of hypocrisy, and even tried to paint Germany as a victim of foreign conspiracies. To some observers, it almost worked. His sharp tongue and quick wit made headlines, and in the early days of the trial, he seemed to dominate the stage. But the longer he spoke, the more hollow his words became. The evidence was too heavy, the documents too precise, the witnesses too many. Goering could sneer at the prosecutors, but he could not sneer away the piles of bodies shown on film. The other defenses. Not every defendant had Goering's bravado. Many chose the strategy of denial or ignorance. Rudolf Hess, who had flown to Scotland in 1941 on his bizarre peace mission, often appeared confused. At times he claimed amnesia, saying he remembered nothing of the Nazi regime. The judges debated whether he was insane or simply pretending. Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal, wept openly when confronted with documents bearing his signature. He insisted he was only following orders, a defense that would echo in courtrooms for decades to come. But the prosecutors reminded him that following orders had meant signing away the lives of millions. And then there was Julius Streicher, the rabid publisher of Der Stürmer. He had never commanded troops or signed military orders. His weapon was words. But those words, years of venomous propaganda, had helped prepare a nation to accept genocide. In court, he shouted, ranted, cursed the Jews even as evidence of extermination was laid bare. His hatred was so naked, so undeniable, that even his fellow defendants avoided him. The psychological battle. The prosecutors quickly realized that the trial was not just about facts, it was also about psychology. Goering, in particular, was trying to rally the other defendants, turning them into a unified front of defiance. In the cells at night, he would preach to them, encouraging silence, loyalty, and denial. For a while, it worked. But the Allies had a secret weapon. Colonel Burton C. Andrus, the American officer in charge of the prison. Andrus rammed the cells with military precision, breaking up communication between the prisoners, isolating Goering whenever he grew too influential. Guards monitored conversations. Every attempt to organize resistance was quietly dismantled. Slowly, the unity crumbled. Some defendants began to crack, whispering confessions, or privately expressing remorse. Others turned on each other, blaming superiors, shifting responsibility, doing everything they could to avoid the noose. And then was the clash with Justice Jackson. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came during the cross-examination of Göring by Robert H. Jackson, the American chief prosecutor. Jackson was determined to break the Reichsmarschall's arrogant facade. The courtroom held its breath as the two men clashed. Göring, the consummate manipulator, and Jackson, the relentless prosecutor. At first, Göring parried every question, twisting words, answering with bravado. He even scored some rhetorical points, making headlines with his defiance. But Jackson pressed harder. He produced documents, orders, evidence that Göring could not laugh away. Bit by bit, the Reichsmarschall's defenses cracked. His smirk faded, his tone grew defensive. By the end, Jackson had achieved what the world needed. He had shown Göring not as a hero or a patriot, but a man caught in his own web of lies. The trial had revealed the true face of the Reichsmarschall, not strength, but cowardice. Seeds of a legacy. As the weeks dragged on, the psychological battle inside the courtroom became as important as the legal one. The defendants wanted to use the trial to rewrite history. Instead, history was rewriting them. The world saw not gods of war, but broken men. Men who hid behind orders, who shifted blame, who denied the obvious. Their grandeur evaporated under the harsh light of justice. And yet, in that struggle, a new standard was emerging. The idea that just following orders was no defense. The principle that leaders could be held accountable not only for what they did, but for what they commanded others to do. It was a principle the world had never seen before, one that would echo into future generations.
After 10 months of testimony, arguments, and revelations, the world's first international war crimes trial finally reached its end. On October 1, 1946, the judges filed into the courtroom to deliver their verdicts. The eyes of the world, through reporters, cameras, and history itself, were fixed on the dock.
Hanging. Joachim von Ribbentrop, guilty, death by hanging. Wilhelm K. Tell, guilty, death by hanging. Julius Streicher, guilty, death by hanging. Rudolf Hess, guilty, but sentenced to life in prison, his mental instability sparing him the rope. Others received long prison terms, 20 years, life sentences, while a handful were acquitted, though few outside the courtroom believed them innocent. In total, 12 men were condemned to die. The judgment was clear. The world had drawn a line in blood and fire. No rank, no uniform, no excuse could protect a man from the consequences of unleashing hell upon humanity. But Hermann Göring was not finished. Even in defeat, he sought control over his own fate. On the night of October 15th, just hours before the scheduled executions, guards found him in his cell, dead. He had swallowed a hidden cyanide capsule smuggled in through means that remain debated to this day. The Reichsmarschall, who had once strutted across Europe in glory, denied the world the satisfaction of seeing him on the gallows. He left behind a final act of defiance, a last attempt to control his narrative. Yet his suicide did not erase the judgment. Instead, it underscored it. Even in death, Göring could not escape the verdict of history. In the early hours of October 16, 1946, the executions began. Inside the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison, a simple wooden gallows had been built, stark, utilitarian, without ceremony. One by one, the condemned were led in. Guards escorted them firmly, but without cruelty. Joachim von Ribbentrop, once the smooth-talking diplomat, walked stiffly, his composure broken. He muttered a few words about peace, then the trapdoor fell. Field Marshal Wilhelm K. Tell, who had signed countless death warrants, now signed his own with every step to the rope. His final words, I call on God Almighty to take pity on the German people." The rope answered for him. Then came Julius Streicher, the hate-monger whose words had poisoned a nation. His defiance remained until the end. As the hood was placed over his head, he shouted into the darkness, "Heil Hitler!" The trapdoor slammed. Silence followed. 12 men had been sentenced. 11 were hanged. The Reich, once built on terror, ended in the quiet creak of ropes in a prison gymnasium. When the executions were complete, the bodies were photographed, their faces pale in death. The photographs were shown to the press, proof that justice had been carried out. To prevent any shrine or place of pilgrimage, the corpses were cremated, their ashes scattered secretly in a Bavarian river. The Nazis, who had dreamed of eternal glory, were denied even graves. They were erased, their remains dispersed like dust in the current of history. The Nuremberg Trials did not solve all questions. Critics argued that the Allies, too, had blood on their hands. The Soviets in particular had used the trials to mask their own atrocities. Some wondered whether true justice was possible in a world still scarred by war. But one fact remained undeniable. For the first time, leaders had been held personally accountable for crimes against humanity. The defense of "I was just following orders" had been shattered forever. From the ashes of Nuremberg came principles that would shape the future. The creation of international law against genocide, the recognition of crimes against humanity as a universal offense, the foundation for future courts in The Hague and beyond. Nuremberg was not perfect, but it was a beginning. As the years passed, the memory of the trials became a symbol. For some, it was justice finally delivered. For others, it was a warning that unchecked power, propaganda, and blind obedience can drag entire nations into darkness. Perhaps the most haunting image was not the gallows, nor the rubble of Nuremberg, but the courtroom itself, a place where the world for the first time said, "Never again." And yet, the question lingers. Has humanity learned? Or are we forever doomed to repeat the same mistakes, each generation forgetting the lessons carved in blood at Nuremberg? That is the question history leaves for us, and the question each man must answer for himself.
On November 20, 1945, the world's attention turned to a gray, war-torn German city, Nuremberg. The Palace of Justice, one of the few large buildings still intact after the bombings, was chosen as the stage. Inside, the atmosphere was cold, heavy, almost unreal. Wooden benches were filled with journalists, lawyers, and soldiers. Behind glass sat 21 of the most infamous men in modern history: Goering, Hess, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and others, the architects of a war that had claimed tens of millions of lives. The judges came from 4 victorious powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Each brought their own perspective, their own sense of justice, but all agreed on one thing: this trial had to be more than vengeance. It had to set a precedent. The charges were fourfold. 1. Crimes against peace, starting an aggressive war. 2. War crimes, violating the rules of war. 3. Crimes against humanity, systematic murder, enslavement, extermination. 4. Conspiracy, the plan behind it all. As the charges were read aloud, the defendants reacted in different ways. Goering smirked, as if mocking the whole proceeding. Hess sat in silence, claiming amnesia. Ribbentrop's hands shook. Keitel broke down in tears. But make no mistake, this wasn't just theater. The Allies brought mountains of evidence, documents signed by the defendants themselves, orders for executions, films of liberated concentration camps, eyewitness testimony. One American prosecutor, Justice Robert H. Jackson, delivered a speech that still echoes through history. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated.
The world was listening.
The prosecution knew one thing: words alone would not be enough. To convict these men, the world had to see what they had done. So for the first time in history, a courtroom became a theater of horror. Projectors hummed, reels of film rolled, and on the walls of Nuremberg's Palace of Justice appeared images that silenced the room. Footage from Buchenwald, Dachau, Auschwitz. Piles of emaciated corpses stacked like firewood. Survivors, barely more than skeletons, stumbling out of barracks. The ovens, still warm when Allied troops arrived. Seasoned soldiers, men who had fought through Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge, broke down in tears. Journalists who had seen bombings and executions put their pens down, unable to write. Even the defendants, some of the most hardened ideologues of the Third Reich, shifted uncomfortably. A few looked away. The documents were just as damning. Signed orders for the final solution. Reports coldly calculating the efficiency of gas chambers. Letters discussing slave labor quotas as if they were factory shipments. One Soviet prosecutor read testimony from survivors of the siege of Leningrad, where starvation was used as a weapon of war. Another presented evidence from massacres in Eastern Europe, where entire villages were wiped out in a single day. The scale of the crimes was beyond comprehension. It was not just murder, it was industrialized murder, a system designed to erase entire peoples. And yet, amid this mountain of evidence, the defendants clung to excuses. Goering argued that the victors had no right to judge the vanquished. Others claimed they were just following orders. Some denied knowledge entirely. But the evidence was overwhelming. The world could no longer look away. When the time came for the accused to take the stand, the courtroom held its breath. This was no ordinary trial. These were the men who had held nations in terror, now stripped of their power, reduced to prisoners in gray suits. Hermann Goering. First was Hermann Goering, Hitler's right-hand man and head of the Luftwaffe. He was sharp, confident, almost theatrical. Unlike the others, he relished the spotlight. He argued with the prosecutors, mocked the charges, and presented himself as a loyal soldier who had simply followed his leader. For a moment, he almost seemed to sway the court with his charisma, but the evidence crushed him. Documents with his signature ordering mass executions. Testimony linking him to the plunder of Europe's art and resources. Goering tried to twist the trial into a political circus, but he could not escape the truth. Rudolf Hess, the Nazi foreign minister Joachim Ribbentrop, was another key figure. He tried to distance himself from Hitler's decisions, painting himself as a mere diplomat. But his signature was on treaties, pacts, and orders that paved the way for war and genocide. When confronted with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that carved up Eastern Europe, he had no answer. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the German High Command, broke down on the stand. He openly wept, admitting he had signed orders for executions, scorched earth policies, and reprisals against civilians. His excuse? He was a soldier, obeying his commander. But obedience to evil, the court reminded him, was not innocence. One by one, they spoke. Some denied, some deflected. A few, like Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, admitted guilt, at least partially. Speer presented himself as a man who had been blinded by ambition, but later realized the enormity of the crimes. Each testimony painted a picture of men who had once seemed larger than life, now revealed as liars, opportunists, zealots, and cowards. And for the world watching, the message grew clearer. These were not gods of war. They were men, men who made choices, men who would now face judgment. After months of testimony, thousands of documents, and countless hours of cross-examination, the judges filed back into the courtroom. The tension was unbearable. This was the moment history would remember. The verdicts were announced, one by one. Hermann Göring, guilty on all counts, sentenced to death by hanging. Joachim von Ribbentrop, guilty, death by hanging. Wilhelm Keitel, guilty, death by hanging. Julius Streicher, guilty, death by hanging. Rudolf Hess, guilty, life imprisonment due to mental instability. Others received long prison sentences, ranging from 10 years to life. Göring, the defiant showman, had one last act of control. Just hours before his execution, he swallowed a hidden cyanide capsule, denying the world the satisfaction of seeing him on the gallows. The executions proceeded the next morning in the prison gym. Simple, wooden gallows, a stark contrast to the grandeur the men once commanded. One by one, the condemned were hanged. Their bodies were cremated afterward, to prevent any memorialization. Though the trial did not erase the horrors, it established a global precedent. Leaders could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. Just following orders was no longer a valid defense. The Nuremberg Trials set the stage for future tribunals in places like The Hague and for prosecuting war crimes in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and beyond. They were not perfect. Questions of victors' justice lingered, but they were the first step in a global reckoning. As Robert Jackson, the chief American prosecutor, said, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated."
Years after the Nuremberg trials, the world began to realize the magnitude of what had been accomplished. These were not just trials of men, but trials of ideas, of morality, of civilization itself. The courtroom in Nuremberg had been more than wood and stone. It had become a mirror reflecting the darkest depths of human ambition and cruelty. The birth of international law. Before Nuremberg, there was little precedent for holding individuals accountable for war crimes. Kings, generals, and dictators had waged wars for centuries, often with impunity. But now, a new principle had been established. No one is above the law. The concept of crimes against humanity became a legal standard recognized worldwide. Leaders, policymakers, and military commanders could no longer claim ignorance or obedience to orders as shields for atrocities. Nuremberg had shown that humanity could hold its own accountable. Inspiring future trials. The legacy of Nuremberg resonated decades later. In the 1990s, international tribunals were set up for the conflicts in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Judges referred back to Nuremberg as the foundation for prosecuting genocide, mass murder, and systematic terror. Without Nuremberg, the idea that world leaders could face justice would have seemed impossible. Personal stories. The trial also left indelible marks on the survivors who testified. Many carried the trauma of camps and massacres, but they also bore witness to history. Their courage ensured that the horrors of the Holocaust and the war would never be denied. They were the voices that made the trials more than a political exercise. They made it human. And the defendants? They became cautionary tales. Göring's suicide, Streicher's venom, Keitel's obedience, Ribbentrop's scheming, all revealed the dangers of blind loyalty, ambition, and ideology unchecked by morality. Lessons for humanity. Nuremberg asks a question that still resonates today. What is justice in the face of unspeakable evil? It forces reflection on power, responsibility, and the choices individuals make when confronted with authority and ideology. The trials remind us that ordinary men can commit extraordinary horrors, and that accountability is the only safeguard against repetition. Even now, more than 70 years later, the words of Robert Jackson echo. The wrongs which we seek to condemn, civilization cannot survive their being repeated. Closing reflection. For viewers today, Nuremberg is more than history. It is a warning, a lesson, and a call to vigilance. The men who sat in the dock were defeated not just by armies, but by justice, evidence, and moral truth. As we look around the world, the question remains, will we remember the lessons of Nuremberg, or are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes? The courtrooms are silent now. The defendants are gone. The ashes have scattered. But the story lives on, in every trial, in every investigation, and every moment when the world must decide between complicity and courage. The Nuremberg trials were not perfect, but they were the first step in holding humanity accountable. And that step changed the course of history forever.